and I'd like to begin by celebrating and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, elders and their ancestors, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and extend that respect to First Nations peoples, elders, and ancestors from elsewhere across the country. My name is Toni Erskine, and I'm a professor of international relations in the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs here at the ANU. Welcome to what I think, and I'm looking to find Emily, is the 6th seminar in this series on discussing AI, automated systems, and the future of war. Now, this seminar series is part of a larger 2-year project on anticipating the future of war, AI, automated systems, and resort to forced decision-making. So we're looking at how AI impacts the decision to go to war at the level of the state. And it's, again, a 2-year project, and it's been generously funded by the Australian government through a grant by Defence. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Logan, to speak on her important work on large language models and intelligence analysis. The title of her talk today is Tell Me What You Don't Know, Large Language Models and the Pathologies of Intelligence Analysis. Now, just to say something about Sarah, Sarah is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations here in the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Prior to joining academia, she worked in intelligence analysis for the Australian government. Her research interests focus on the impact of information technology on international politics. Her current projects include a study of the relationship between information and political authority and an assessment of the impact of big tech on state capacities to exercise control over political violence. And her single-authored monograph, Hold Your Friends Close, Countering Radicalization in Britain and America, was published by Oxford University Press just this year. This is a superb and important book, and if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to do so. I want to say as well, the work that Sarah is going to discuss here, some of it has been published very recently in the Australian Journal of International Affairs. I've got some copies of her article on the table in the corner, along with some other publications on the project. After the talk, please feel free to help yourself to any of the publications on the table. And I think Sarah is going to speak between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So please have your questions ready. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Toni. Thank you for such a generous introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Toni for organising this fantastic program of research and to the Department of Defence for supporting it. Today, I'm going to be talking about a paper I wrote, as Toni mentioned, for a special issue of the Australian Journal of International Affairs. You can see the name of the paper up on the slide there. The paper focuses on the role of AI in intelligence analysis in the context of the decision to resort to force. The goal of all my research is to bring AI into the context of the information work that we already do. I want to step outside the hype cycle of AI and to ask what it is that AI is really doing here and how does it relate to what we already do? Is it an intensified version of something that we already do? Is it something completely new? Is it a game changer? Answering those questions helps us to make decisions about how to govern AI. That's at the core of my research. By using or tweaking existing frameworks, for example, by developing entirely new ones, but in the process, hopefully not getting lost in the lure of the novel. So the title of the paper actually comes from a quote from General Colin Powell, who you can see up there. He served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 1989 to 1993. And during that time, he's said to have told his intelligence analysis staff, as an intelligence officer, your responsibility is to tell me what you know, to tell me what you don't know, and then you're allowed to tell me what you think. But you always need to keep those three separated. So what he's getting at here is the fundamental problem which lies at the heart of intelligence analysis. And that is that at its heart, analysis is essentially about making imperfect judgments. The job of the analyst exists because we as humans cannot know everything there is to know about any given situation. The practice of intelligence analysis is driven by judgments about what is and what is not likely to happen in the world. And this is precisely because analysts do not know and cannot know. There's an important difference between analysis, judgment, and prediction here. And that do not know and cannot know feature is something that all intelligence analysts must manage. And that's what Powell is asking his staff to do here. They're telling what they don't know, because inevitably there are things that they don't know. To understand what they do know and make the correct judgment about it, They must be clear on what it is they do not know, to bracket that out. So in this paper, I argue that this fundamental condition of intelligence analysis, that you cannot know everything, is driven by two informational pathologies. So that's kind of one of the key terms there, informational pathologies. They're features of the informational landscape that cause problems for intelligence analysis, that underlie it. They're the problem that analysts try and solve, and which any good analyst has to find a workaround for. So today I'll focus mainly on giving an overview of two key terms which drive my arguments: informational scarcity and epistemic scarcity. So they're two examples of what I call informational pathologies. And I'll show how those terms apply to classic intelligence analysis as we understand it, and then show or argue how that they apply to intelligence analysis driven by AI in a particular way, especially in the context of resort to force. So let's get started. So information scarcity means that on occasion there may simply not be enough information about a situation with which to make a correct judgment. Sometimes we just don't know. And the resulting intelligence gaps are a feature of the information environment in which intelligence analysis takes place. So the missile gap theory, which developed in the US during the late 1950s and 1960s, is a really good example here. And this picture up here is a picture from the CIA archives of a surveillance shot of the Soviet R-2 missile on parade. It's from the early 60s. So at this time, US intelligence had really limited collection abilities behind the Iron Curtain, but had a really strong drive, understandably, to understand the state of Soviet ballistic missile technology and stock compared to the US. Given information scarcity, they just did not know. Analysts made their judgment by extrapolating US missile production capabilities at the time to the Soviet context, in the process significantly overestimating Soviet capacities and judging erroneously that Soviet forces had significantly more missiles available to them than they did. And that had important consequences for inflationary American military spending. So the intelligence leading to the erroneous judgment of the missile gap was addressed by improved intelligence collection mechanisms introduced towards the end of the 50s, minimising the problem of information scarcity and changing national intelligence estimates about Soviet capacities to the extent that the so-called missile gap was discredited. So intel analysts can address information scarcity, historically speaking, by developing new sources of intelligence, developing new surveillance technologies. So epistemic scarcity is related, but also different. It's driven by information scarcity, but it refers to a lack of deeper knowledge about the world, not just the lack of information. So consider, for example, the intelligence failures preceding September 11, the attacks of September 11. It's not that there was a lack of information, for example, about the fact that individuals were taking flying lessons but not interested in learning how to land. It wasn't that there was a lack of signals chatter about the fact that an attack was coming. The issue was that the information, one of the main issues was that the information wasn't combined together to create new knowledge about new actors and new plans. Information scarcity then is linked to epistemic scarcity, but more information doesn't necessarily mean better knowledge about the world or better judgments and greater epistemic security. So intel analysts can try and deal with epistemic scarcity by dealing strategically with known intelligence gaps, and that's what Colin Powell is urging his staff to do in that initial slide. Or bureaucracies can deal with it as well by rearranging their analysis capacities and guidelines, as was the case for the US intelligence community after 9/11, for example. So what do we know about the use of AI and the resort to force decision-making? So AI is and will increasingly be used in intelligence analysis for a number of different tasks. What I'm particularly interested in is the use of generative AI, which draws on the capabilities of large language models. So like the one that powers ChatGPT, for example. The manual processing of very large volumes of data has historically been a highly resource-intensive and time-consuming process, but one that's essential to the process of intelligence analysis. So LLMs could be used, for example, for software development, including cybersecurity testing, automated drafting of knowledge extraction, where the model extracts information from a large corpus of data, analyses it and presents it, and also for large-scale text analytics. And these tasks could include translation, generating summaries, developing new code. And inevitably, as LLMs continue to improve, their use in these tasks will be part of the decision to go to war, the resort to force decision-making. So I'm arguing that LLMs, in this paper, what I argue is that LLMs in this context is A, inevitable, and B, compounds what we know already about the informational pathologies of intelligence analysis by increasing the problem of information scarcity rather than reducing it or minimising it, and also intensifying the problem of epistemic scarcity and thereby introducing additional levels of complexity in the information gathering that precedes and is used to justify decision-making on the result pool. So my argument is that AI is not a completely separate and new process to what we know about the way intelligence already operates. Instead, I argue that AI in intelligence analysis intensifies these existing informational pathologies. So let's go back and think about how the use of AI might do this. So on information scarcity, for intelligence agencies in the West, the information age is essentially a post-9/11 age. The attacks of September 11 generated a drive for new surveillance technologies and a global all-source reach and outreach capacity. So you remember General Alexander, head of the CIA or the NSA at the time, collect it all, let's get it all. But rather than reducing the problem of scarcity, I'm arguing that the resulting abundance of information and the burden of a new global remit means the analytic problem of information scarcity is increasingly pathologized because of changes in the structure of the global information environment. It's not enough just to collect it all, and perhaps we can't because of the way the world looks now. So key among these changes is the increase in importance and abundance of private actors in the information landscape, especially as it relates to intelligence. So like everyone else, national security agencies are subject to market incentives regarding trade secrecy in the context of LLMs and generative AI. So this means that technology companies routinely limit access to both the data underpinning generative AI and the technology which might reveal it. So OpenAI, for example, which developed ChatGPT, has released almost no data about ChatGPT-4, for example, and operates the service entirely on its own servers. This limits users' capacities to understand the technology, to check it for interference, and to adapt it to their own uses. National security agencies have limited capacity to respond to these limitations. They don't have the capacity to develop their own LLMs in the same way. And primarily, this is because they don't have access to the expertise. We can talk separately about the problem of the workforce problem, if you like. But separately to that, they also don't have the access to the large corpora of data required to develop an effective LLMs. So this means that intelligence agencies need to purchase the data to build them. Social media giants and data brokers, for example, hold information, data, which intelligence agencies in the West at least, can't either legally or technologically access. This means that if those agencies wish to access these huge language corpora to build their own LLMs, they must buy them from either social media companies or data brokers. In the case of social media companies, this access is complicated by the fact that social media giants have every interest in denying a range of entities, including but not limited to governments, the capacity to scrape their data, meaning they regularly change their algorithms to dissuade agencies and others from scraping publicly available information. And additionally, for reasons of consumer sentiment, many Western social media companies are reluctant to sell their data to national security agencies, at least, even though they might freely sell it to other entities. And similar restrictions of reputation and taint are likely to apply to LLMs themselves, at least in the West again. So as suggested by Google employee protests concerning Pentagon and Google collaboration on an AI-driven targeting tool, for example. So on that question of private actors, just to bring it home, I wonder if any of you remember the story of Brigadier Lee Rigby, who we see up here. So he was murdered on a street in central London in 2005 by an Islamist extremist. In the report of the parliamentary inquiry into the murder, UK intelligence agencies argued that those agencies didn't have access to content held by US-based social media companies such as Facebook and Google, which could have alerted them to the plans for the impending attack and helped them to avoid it. Indeed, they argued that without this information, they were unable to stop the attack going ahead. Regardless of whether this is true or not, what we do know is that they were operating under conditions of information scarcity, just as all intelligence policing and national security and law enforcement agencies do in this context. So the problem wasn't that they didn't have enough leads or sources, it was that the American social media companies held information that they did not and could not share, or did not share and would not share. This is the sort of private actor influence I'm talking about when I talk about the problem of informational scarcity and AI. Private actors like social media companies, data brokers, play a huge role in collection and curation of data which drives AI, and states must contend with these actors in new ways. It's not that informational scarcity has gone away, it's just changed. And it's not just social media companies that are the important actors here. Intelligence agencies across the globe can access other sorts of open source information by buying large amounts of commercially available information, or CAI, from data brokers. So this is things like geospatial data, shipping data, financial data, and so on. So this information is available for sale, but it's an open, largely unregulated marketplace. A recent report from the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence shows how CAI, commercially available information, can induce a type of information scarcity for the intelligence community in the sense that there's no models for verifying the quality of that information or its reliability, and no way to effectively integrate it into existing analytic systems, and no way to effectively inoculate it from interference. So again, information scarcity is an informational pathology of intelligence analysis, and it's intensified and changed in new and important ways by the information landscape, which underpins artificial intelligence, and by the political economy of that environment. LLMs in intelligence analysis compound not only informational scarcity, but also epistemic scarcity, the capacity to know. And key to this problem is the problem of bias. So that's widely discussed elsewhere, and I won't really be talking about a lot today. It's the problems of bias in algorithmic bias that most of you are probably familiar with. It's like hiring, policing, those sorts of things. So for LLMs used in intelligence analysis, this bias can be classed as an intensification of epistemic scarcity. Beyond or embedded in problems of bias is LLM's reliance on online data as a way to build models. That's where most of the data comes from. It's an easy way to get huge amounts of data. Most LLMs scrape online data as a way to build models, or they used existing corpora of digitized text. So especially problematic in this context is the fact that most of the internet comprises English language text, even though most of the world speaks a language other than English as their native language. So native English speakers comprise only 5% all language speakers globally, whereas Chinese speakers comprise 16%, according to some estimates, just as one example. By comparison, according to some estimates, almost 64% of all websites use English as their content language. This suggests that the language balance of online text swings sharply to English, even though almost 3/4 of the world's online population doesn't speak English, and despite English's paltry global native speaker status. This means that LLMs derived from what is essentially a limited sample set risk embedding and amplifying epistemic missteps, given the epistemic richness that is encoded in language itself. There's a reason that after 9/11, the US increased its its stock of language experts in Afghan and other Middle Eastern languages. It's because knowledge is embedded in language in really important ways, and LLMs that rely on online data, as most of them do, risk really important epistemic dangers, I'd say, in that process. So multilingual LLMs are one possible solution to this problem, but they suffer from translation degradation across languages, and they're yet to achieve sophisticated generative capacities. Another solution might be offered by efforts to address the paucity of language models outside English, and that is by using open source LLMs. So Hugging Face, for example, is a great example here. So users contribute training data and other resources in a range of what are called low token languages, where not a lot of digitized tokens exist. These are as yet unlikely to be as agile and comprehensive as a human speaker can be, a native speaker can be, or as a good analyst can be. So given the importance of online data to training LLMs, information and epistemic scarcity are compounded also by the physically limited data available on the internet. Even if we accept that most of it is in English and perhaps not that useful for some of the questions that we want to ask, it's still limited, it's physically limited. Online data is simply running out. Though, for example, one recent estimate puts the internet's total stock of usable text data at between 4.6 and 17.2 trillion tokens. DeepMind's Chinchilla, for example, was trained on 1.4 trillion tokens. There's not much of a gap there. And some research suggests that the problem may be addressed by LLMs which can generate their own training data or refine their learning through processes of self-interrogation. But this doesn't address the basic problem of epistemic scarcity via bounded initial training data. So a more abstract problem of epistemic scarcity in LLMs used for intelligence analysis is the problem of semantic capacity. And this goes to that original problem of bias that we always talk about in this context. So the neural networks which are trained on LLMs are inherently probabilistic. I'm not sure I'm saying that word correctly. That means they rely on prediction to generate text rather than generating a novel representation of the actual semantics involved. That's what humans do. Instead, LLMs simply mimic representations which have occurred elsewhere in the data on which they're trained. This is a really basic explanation. This means they don't have the ability to produce valid cause and effect representations of relationships between objects in text. They prioritise instead what is plausible based on what they've been trained on, rather than what is accurate. Such representations are essential, though, to producing judgments, analytic judgments. This is the key role of intelligence analysis, as we alluded to right at the beginning of the presentation. It's not just prediction, it's judgment. It's an important difference there. So returning to resort to forced decision-making, this plausibility preference that LLMs have is essentially a problem of induction, and it's highly concerning. So not only are the stakes extremely high, accuracy is important in unbelievably catastrophic outcomes if accuracy is sacrificed to plausibility. Not only is it highly concerning, but the decision to go to war is a highly unusual one, presumably following highly unusual events. So how, for an example, can an LLM train generative AI for a black swan event like 9/11, or an event involving languages, actors, and ideas that existed before the LLM was devised, or outside its linguistic boundaries? If the LLM does not have training data necessary to understand the events surrounding resort to forced decisions, then it can deliver a plausible but not necessarily a truthful or accurate response. It cannot think when the unthinkable is at stake. So I debated for a long time about whether to use an example from the current Israel-Gaza conflict in my talk, but here it is. So senior Israeli intelligence officials have publicly acknowledged that the horrific Hamas surprise attack on October 7th that killed roughly 1,200 Israelis and has generated countless further deaths in Gaza was a massive failure by the country's intelligence apparatus. So what is going on here? There are obviously a number of separate intelligence failures going on here, most of which are currently under investigation by the Israeli state. What we do know is that the Gaza Strip is one of the most heavily surveilled territories on Earth, and that the IDF has one of the most capable and technologically sophisticated intelligence collection mechanisms anywhere. We also know that the IDF has, for a comparatively long time, used AI to generate predictive analytics in intelligence analysis. And yet, paragliders and bulldozers were able to institute a hugely shocking and devastating attack on the Israeli population, with further devastating consequences for the region and globally. What's going on? In the case of the October 7th attack, Israeli officials appeared to have failed to understand and even dismiss the indications and warning intelligence which suggested that Hamas would execute such a brazen plan. Israeli officials reportedly were aware of the 40-page plan for the attack for more than a year prior to it taking place. The plans were circulated amongst intelligence leaders and officials, but experts believe that Hamas was not capable of carrying them out. Israeli intelligence then failed to recognise indications that the plan in their position was being executed. They had the data and they didn't act on it. Why? What we see here is arguably, is at least in one sense, there's lots of things going on here, but one of the problems is a problem of epistemic scarcity that is compounded by the use of AI, by the information environment that we find ourselves in. In a threat-rich environment like Gaza, the IDF receives thousands of credible threats on a daily basis, many of them delivered as a result of data-rich surveillance. An attack using paragliders and bulldozers hadn't happened before. Therefore, we and AI don't know that it will. We can't predict it because we don't already know it, and we can't judge it because we outsource that process in some ways to AI. It's not just the outsourcing, though. There's something else going on here that I'm struggling to define, and maybe we can talk about this in Q&A. For the moment, I'm calling it the fire hose problem. So we have a data-rich environment, but not the right sort of knowledge emerging from it, precisely because it is data-rich. It's amplifying the basic problem of epistemic scarcity, which all intelligence analysis encounters. There's that plausibility problem, the prediction problem, but there's also something else going on about volume, which I'm sort of struggling to define. So where do we go from here? There are, of course, tech solutions. I've touched on a couple of them. I kind of dismissed them a little bit. And I'm happy to talk further about them. But the basic response for me is, of course, there are tech solutions emerging all the time. Can intelligence agencies in the West build their own models? Probably. There are new tenders out at the moment for US military actors, for companies to help US military actors own the technical baseline, all by developing native LLMs. It's not specified how that will work. That's a private actor problem. But that in itself is the underlying issue here. It's not that tech can't save us, it's that it probably won't. New techniques are being developed where LLMs can generate their own training data to overcome the limitations of the data. I'm not familiar with any conclusive evidence on whether these overcome the probability of the pathologies we've described. But in the end, this is a kind of tech utopianism, and it renders intelligence analysis as event prediction. And it allows the essential business of intelligence to get caught up in endless hype cycles. That's the private actor problem here. And the problem of confusing judgment with prediction. It embeds the work of government into the foibles and incentives of the private sector in a way which is non-transparent and unaccountable. It means not only is it non-transparent, unaccountable, there's all sorts of really important democratic governance implications there, but also it means we cannot learn. If you look at those examples I've used already of 9/11, there are lots of learning that takes place there. How does that work when the private sector runs it? We already have models for accessing data. This is where I think that states have some capacity to move here. Maybe not states like Australia, and that's something that we should discuss openly. So we have models for accessing data held by private actors. So the Cloud Act, for example, the Clarifying Lawful Use of Overseas Data Act, recently implemented in the US, the UK and Australia, allows those, Australia and the UK to access data held by US tech platforms for some law enforcement and national security uses. There's also emerging initiatives at the OECD level to re-territorialise these big tech platforms to make them more accountable for tax purposes. So that means territorialising them, bringing states back in, if you like, making platforms beholden to states in terms of their data and their capacities. So neither of these approaches solve the underlying problems of privacy and accountability, which embed the sort of everyday surveillance environment that we find ourselves in. But they do offer some ideas for how states like Australia, which have no leverage in the international data brokerage market, can use existing alliance relationships and other types of relationships to increase, maintain and further their access to critically important data in the context of AI development for resort to force decision making. And my final recommendation is about governance. And I've said that the main aim of my research is to situate AI in the context of what we already know and what we already do. And I've shown, I hope, that the use of AI in resort to force decision making can intensify existing informational pathologies in intelligence analysis. So my final point is an argument or a plea really for an emphasis on accuracy as well as speed and on transparency, which allows not only accountability, but also learning. And I guess what I'm thinking of here is a sort of epistemic humility to be built into AI systems and the intelligence cycle which accompanies them, to recognise the limitations of AI and indeed the limitations of knowledge, to recognise that despite the hype, informational pathologies persist and they shape what we can know and also how we can know. Thank you.